It looks from the outset that while many, I think, expected, at least those who were predicting the war like me, a large-scale Russian military operation in Ukraine, what Moscow actually attempted was a very puzzling operation. It was an effort at quick regime change. They actually hoped and expected to either overthrow Zelensky or get him to surrender within a matter of days. And so the initial military operation, I think, defied many local expectations because it was essentially an effort to get troops quickly to the Ukrainian capital, to Kiev, and to push forces down into Ukraine, not expecting much resistance. So initial Russian forces went in. They didn't go in as sort of combined arms maneuver formations, expecting a fight. They're trying to skirt around major cities and actually thinking that they were going to avoid substantial resistance. They didn't actually expect the Ukrainian military to put up a fight. Now, well, I think from our point of view, the planning assumptions might have been very puzzling, but it's very clear that intellectually, I think the Kremlin had not moved on anywhere since 2014. They essentially were trying to do a much larger version of what had happened in 2014. And there are two other aspects to this operation. The first is they clearly misled the troops. They did not tell the troops they were sending them to war until the very last minute. They told them we're going on exercises. They pushed them to the border, told them not to worry, and then said that they are going to Ukraine, but that this was actually a special operation and that they shouldn't encounter much resistance. And this is why in the initial 48 hours, if you saw the way Russian forces were operating, you too might have been very puzzled, because Russian troops essentially drove into Ukraine as though they were still in their own country. Like they weren't expecting substantial resistance. They simply started driving down the roads. And they started driving down the small detachments. And I'm sure those illusions were shattered when they ran into the first Ukrainian checkpoint or ambush to find out that they were actually in a very real war. And early on, most Russian military power sat on the sidelines. For example, in the first week, we had questions about kind of the missing case of the Russian Air Force. The war started with several hours of cruise missile strikes and ballistic missile strikes. The Russian Air Force basically limited itself to small cases of close air support, meaning there was no major air campaign. There are hundreds of Russian aircraft sitting around Ukrainian air bases, hundreds of Russian combat helicopters, but in the early days, they were largely unused. And it's clear that in Moscow, they believed that they actually could succeed in this operation early on without much of a fight, without having to employ its combat power. I have two hypotheses as to why, at least a theory as to why they thought they could get away with it. First, they're trying to keep the war secret from the public. They called it a special operation at Donbass for a reason. In the initial week, they were not admitting that this was actually a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. They were trying to keep it secret, in some ways not dissimilar from the way they were keeping the fighting in 2014 and 2015 secret. They let on that there was some fighting, but they were not trying to characterize the true nature of what they were attempting to do. And if they had used military power and air power on a large scale early on, those images would have been pretty difficult to control. And of course, they quickly shut down what was left of independent media, and they told everybody else that they couldn't even call it a war. Literally, they had to call it a special operation. And the second part is, I think they hope to avoid some of the worst sanctions from the West. And I think they figured they could avoid them if they conducted a quick operation that appeared relatively bloodless, and somehow they sold themselves intellectually on the fact that this was possible. I think a lot of that had to do with sort of the echo chamber of assumptions inside Moscow itself, inside the political leadership. Okay, so they end up with the worst of all worlds. The initial operation was a failure, and it was doomed to be a failure because its assumptions had little relationship to reality, right? Second, they got the worst of all the sanctions, and even far more than they expected in the initial days. They did not reach initial operational success. They got a pretty bad bloody nose early on and took some substantial casualties in the early part of the war. And they completely seeded the information domain by trying to keep it secret. So Ukraine, in fact, is winning across the board in terms of shaping the narrative, and so are Western countries to support Ukraine. And only recently have they tried to mobilize the Russian public now in support of the war, realizing that they're in a protracted conflict.